Welcome back to Data Science for Drug Discovery, Health, and Translational Medicine, DSDHT. I'm Jeremy Yang, Associate Instructor. This is Drug Discovery, History, and Paradigms, Module 5. Thank you to Instructor Professor Joanne Luciano for inviting me to present this and 3 additional modules, which will be covering bioinformatics, cheminformatics, and drug discovery. I'm delighted to be part of this very interesting course, so let's get started with our topic. Let's put this module in context. As you know, there are a huge number of big topics covered by this course. There are also 3 motivating questions. Question 1 is, how can data science help researchers find new drugs and reuse old ones? So this module, Drug Discovery, History, and Paradigms, directly relates to that, but so do the next 3 on bioinformatics and medicine, and cheminformatics, which apply directly to drug discovery. As you know, we cannot go into great depth on any of these topics, but we will pick and choose examples, which we can then apply data science to, and we hope learn how data science could be applied to many, many more. And in so doing, get a sense of the breadth and importance of these many topics. So now we start our topic for real, the drug discovery paradigms. And these are the 4 paradigms which we'll present, and the names we'll give them, and roughly some dates where we put them on the human timeline. First, empirical, dating back to the beginning of human existence as a species. Vitamins, vaccines, and antibiotics since 1800. Rational since roughly 1960, and integrative since roughly 2010. There is a context, and although this is a drug discovery paradigms module, these things are not just about drug discovery, really. And so the context is public health, the evolution of science and medicine, and so there is a bigger context which is needed to understand this history and these paradigms. Why do we care about history? Well, to paraphrase a great writer, I think it was Faulkner, history is not even over. These paradigms are active now. We are still using empiricism and much of that paradigm where data is driving us. Vitamins, vaccines, and antibiotics are certainly very important to health and medicine. And rational and integrative certainly are ongoing. So there's history, but this is now as well. The first drug discovery paradigm we call empirical, meaning simply from data, from experience. And we date it back to the beginnings of human existence, which roughly is 200,000 years ago. And although there's no history dating back that far, or records, it seems reasonable to infer that the human species inhabited the earth by learning what they could eat and couldn't eat, and learning rather well. And in so doing, learned that there were some plants and substances which were health altering, and so one could easily describe this as the beginnings of drug discovery. We specify the date 754 in history as when the first pharmacy, identifies it as such, opened in Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. And you could associate that with just this conception that there were special compounds or materials, substances which had a medicinal or pharmaceutical effect. In the 1800s is when many of the big pharmaceutical companies were founded in various ways, and so at least there was the beginnings of some standardization, some understanding that there were chemical compounds that were had special properties in the body, and that medicine was not a matter of magic or superstition, but there were some special compounds. Regardless of whether specific preparations were therapeutic or not, this understanding did drive progress to some extent. Also important, natural products, meaning coming from nature as opposed to being synthesized. Traditional medicines, and by traditional we mean culturally passed along, whether orally or otherwise, from one generation to another, and therefore associated with particular cultures, be it traditional Chinese medicine, Indian medicine, Native American medicine, or any other in any cultural tradition. It's worth noting that these historical eras also reflected a relative to the present, relatively limited disease scope. Major focuses were pain relief and infectious disease, which made a great deal of sense given the problems, the health issues that faced our ancestors. And we'll get into that more in subsequent slides. The pictures at the bottom are what might be a familiar example of natural products associated with the poppy flower. On the right, poppy pods and seeds. Maybe you had some of those seeds recently on a poppy seed bagel or in a muffin. You may also know that those pods can be used to produce some very powerful drugs, including codeine, morphine, and heroin. So a very famous and important example of natural products which have existed and continue to exist in our pharmacopoeia. The second paradigm to describe we call vitamins, vaccines, and antibiotics. And really these are three separate things scientifically, but in the history of drug discovery, they became very important roughly over the same era, and all three had huge impact on human health and medicine. And we're dating this from about 1800, and in immunology it was increasingly understood that by having some exposure to a disease, perhaps a weakened form, some defenses, a human being could develop defenses. So concepts of immunology were developed. So for example, the smallpox vaccines were developed in some measure as far back as that. Nutrition relates to the vitamin deficiency diseases, as listed here: scurvy, a deficiency of vitamin C, somewhat associated with sailors who had to go without fruit or vegetable and vitamin C for months at a time; pellagra, deficiency of vitamin B3, beriberi, B1, rickets, D. All these diseases have terrible and painful symptoms and can result in death. An understanding that they can be prevented and cured by a simple substance which is readily available was a huge discovery and a huge benefit to health. Over these eras, malnutrition, infectious diseases were predominant risks to human health. We also saw so-called wonder drugs emerge, which had incredible benefits. Penicillin in the mid-20th century, perhaps the most famous antibiotic of all time, saved millions of lives. Likewise, the polio vaccine saved so many people from debilitating disease. At the bottom is a diagram of penicillin, and perhaps that conveys this idea that there are these special compounds which are really relatively simple, easy to draw on a whiteboard or piece of paper, but to think that that simple thing can save millions of lives is a powerful idea, and perhaps part of why this phrase wonder drug still has great resonance. Here are a few statistics, some data, if you will, to help illustrate and justify some of what we're saying about this paradigm. Back in history, you've heard of the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, which occurred in the Middle Ages in Europe, and they estimate about 100 million deaths, which is a big number now, but then it was roughly 1/3 of the European population. So a little hard to even fathom, to conceive of that impact, but it is a big deal, and it remains a big deal in our history. In 1918, in the world, there was an influenza epidemic. It was called by some the Spanish flu, although in fact it was almost certainly not Spanish and probably originated in the United States. It resulted in approximately 20 million deaths, or roughly 1% of the world's population, although in many parts of the world the rate was much higher than 1%. So again, to try to imagine 1% of the world population dying of an epidemic now, it's a little hard to fathom that kind of impact, but that is a quite well documented epidemic. We're going to look at life expectancy and infant mortality a little bit more, two important measures or metrics of public health. Infant mortality being defined as death in the first year of life. Here's a little bit more data on this topic from a very interesting website and resource that I encourage you to explore, called gapminder.org. The data relates to life expectancy and infant mortality rates over time, roughly in the last century. And I picked 3 places, Canada, China, and the USA, and 3 years, 1900, 1950, and 2000. And I hope that these numbers help tell you a story of the ways in which things have changed significantly. Canada and the US, relatively, healthy countries in 1900, and the life expectancy was 48 and 49, respectively. In China, much higher poverty rates, life expectancy 32. So these are relatively low numbers compared to today, aren't they? All the numbers go up over the century, which is very encouraging. And yes, there's some negative stuff in this presentation, and when we look at issues related to health, but these are very inspiring and positive news facts. Life expectancy has extended a great deal. Similarly, infant mortality, these numbers used to be drastically different. Canada recorded an infant mortality of 18.7%, so 1 in 5 children would die before their first birthday. No number for China in 1900, but in 1950 the number was quite similar, 19.5%. The U.S. didn't keep statistics in 1900, which in some ways is indicative of its lack of public health systems. In any case, these numbers have drastically decreased. Now, parents expect their children to survive, and they generally do. It is considered quite tragic when a baby passes away, and yet this used to be so normal. Next drug discovery paradigm we call rational, and we're dating it from approximately 1960. And in some ways it is a culmination of the scientific understandings which grew and then encompassed molecular biology with the understanding of DNA and biochemistry, and with advances in computer science, which gave us tools to process data from these areas. The lock and key concept is associated with this rational drug discovery paradigm, meaning that a selective drug will target a particular drug target, which is typically a protein molecule in the human body, and by selectively modulating that protein will result in a therapeutic effect. And so the entire rational paradigm reflects a belief that by fully understanding the molecular basis of disease and then designing a drug to target that specific mechanism, we can rationally develop a drug for a particular disease. And the discoveries and methodology which accompany this approach are really impressive. And there have been some big successes. So at bottom left, there is a screenshot from a YouTube video, which is linked to this lesson. So you can check that out. And it is a computer model of a drug bound to HIV-1 protease, which is part of the HIV human immunodeficiency virus or AIDS virus, which thereby can treat the disease. So it was true, and it is true, that by understanding the molecular basis of this infection, this disease, HIV/AIDS, scientists were able to design rationally a drug to address that disease. So it's a great success, and HIV is so much more treatable now than it was, say, in the 80s and 90s. This era also was accompanied by an expanded disease scope. So remember, before we were looking at pain and infectious disease, and as life expectancy increased, now the disease scope includes metabolic diseases, cancer, and mental health. So that's kind of an additional or contextual point, but it is relevant because we're not trying to accomplish the same things. We have a much bigger disease scope. Bottom right is a schematic there of a DNA molecule, which simply reflects this understanding of molecular biology, which underlies this rational approach. To understand disease at a molecular level, we have to understand DNA and how it's expressed as proteins and how we can modulate those proteins. So this understanding is all part of the rational drug discovery paradigm. This is one representation of the so-called rational drug discovery pipeline, which reflects some of the economics of drug discovery as well as the science. But however much you're interested in economics, it is a simple fact that economics plays a big role in what science does occur. And so it is helpful to understand the economic drivers which then influence which resources are devoted to science. So in this pipeline, it's thought of as a linear process, although it can be quite lengthy in time, as you can see. Having identified some disease, you then need to elucidate or understand the molecular details or mechanism. So isolating a protein involved in the disease, also called target validation, that can take much time and can be expensive. Preclinical testing can take time, and there can be in vitro tests, there can be animal models reflected by the mouse there. At some point, if you think you have a good drug and it passes animal testing, then you move forward through the development cycle and you apply for clinical trials, and the costs go up and up. And if everything goes well, you finally can market a drug, but the time is long, and the costs are great, and they increase as you go forward. So one of the phrases used to describe choices is fail early as much as possible, because those failures are cheaper and that gives you more attempts. The information on this slide may help us to understand why the rational drug discovery paradigm and the pipeline described on the previous slide is not sufficient, has not worked as well as we would like, and certainly not as well as the drug companies would like. So, for example, this first plot is about R&D spending versus new drug applications, and how, despite strong spending, the number of applications has not gone up proportionally. Next, over here, we look at the many reasons for failure of drugs in the development phase, which would suggest that our pipeline is somehow not taking into account some of the complexity that is required for drug discovery. This third plot shows a steady decline in new molecular entities per unit of R&D spending, and it's inflation adjusted, so fewer molecular entities. I happen to believe in part that that's because drug companies have an incentive to make money, not new molecular entities, but that is a detail to some extent, and overall we are trying to come up with new molecular entities, we being the entire drug discovery community, academic and corporate. Finally, this last slide gives us some idea that the disease scope has expanded. If we look at the cancers and autoimmune and metabolic related diseases here, that gives us some idea that it's a bigger scope than it used to be. Again, we have some more evidence perhaps of a flawed paradigm and a flawed pipeline based on the number of drug withdrawals which have occurred. And I would also add that part of the picture, part of the story here is that we have some good regulation and monitoring, and so the safety concerns are addressed, if not as soon as we'd like. So there's good news here in that safety is of high concern, but the bad news is that these drugs, which were hoped to be great, it turns out had some negative aspects, some liabilities, which resulted in their withdrawal. So we would infer that there's a flawed system that led to these drugs, and we'd like to do better. The final and newest paradigm of drug discovery, which we'll describe, we're calling integrative. And it is arguably the current paradigm and is still being developed and understood. And it also integrates the other paradigms. So in that sense, it's not brand new. It is, however, reflects an understanding that the rational paradigm is not sufficient. It's perhaps too reductionist, that all of the kinds of data and information that have been used in the past have to be incorporated, and simply that biology is very complex. We're dating this since about 2010. There are science and technology drivers, including understandings of systems biology, which is roughly definable as biology understood in a complex way, where one must take into account the interconnectedness of biological entities such as cells and proteins in a single organism or among organisms. Informatics is another driver, our ability to harness the power of data and data science, part of the title of this course. Data integration is also a driving ability, and by data integration we include many sorts of data: molecular, clinical, genomic, bibliological, meaning from the scientific literature, epidemiological, and again, this idea of systems biology, or perhaps network biology, which is depicted to some extent on the right, is a rather new understanding, and among others, Professor Barabasi has become well known for promoting this view, and I would encourage you to look at some of his writings and papers. The idea in general is that to represent the complexity that is life and the interconnectedness of organisms and biology, one must represent the knowledge and investigate the knowledge with that same kind of data model. And this is what we were trying to do. This is an interesting paper which relates to our topic and our point. An end to the myth. There's no drug development pipeline. So again, this relates to the rational drug discovery paradigm and pipeline. And roughly the argument here is that this is an oversimplification to the point of falsehood, that the pipeline, even when it works, is not so much a pipeline as a set of feedback loops, interactions between scientists. There's a lot of complexity in any drug development effort, which is not reflected by some kind of linear pipeline model. So let's keep it straight. We have this idea that health and biology is itself a set of interconnected and complex interactions. Then there's maybe a data model that describes that biological reality in a complex way. And this here we're talking about a process at a drug company or elsewhere, and that process also involving lots of scientists and apparatus and experimental and theoretical methods, that also is complex. Still from that 2013 paper, there is a diagram which may be helpful. The authors of that paper are part of an interesting group called the Genetic Alliance, and they have defined this different paradigm, which is not a linear pipeline. They call it Navigating the Ecosystem of Translational Sciences, NETS, NETS, and this diagram reflects some of its complexity, and you can see that there are kind of these loops and interactions between different groups, such as clinical research, meaning people who actually touch patients, basic science, people in labs, and knowledge base, so more informatics, and so on. So some of the complexity of their paradigm for the discovery process. Still on the same paper, and with another of the diagrams from that paper, a bit more detail as to exactly how these roles in the drug discovery process interact. Drilling down even further, so maybe you can read some of the words on these diagrams. What I want you to take away in part as a data scientist is that there are many specialties within something like drug discovery. A data scientist could participate in one or more, but for us to even talk about drug discovery as one thing can be a little bit deceptive. There are many, many parts. On this slide, we see high throughput screening, compound libraries, assay development. That is a huge area with a lot of data, a lot of expertise. That is an area where a lot of resources are spent, and data science can play a huge role in, for example, analyzing the outputs of high throughput screening experiments, which can generate many millions of data points, and informing scientists as to the most likely leads and hits which might best be brought forward for follow-up and analysis as potential leads. So that's just one of many areas in this large endeavor which could be addressed by data science. Okay, final slide. What are our take-home messages from this section? The drug discovery paradigms. Well, that historically finding new medicines was empirical, meaning learning from experience, and that means natural products and traditional medicine for the most part. Science has produced so-called wonder drugs, which are truly wonderful, such as antibiotics and vaccines. But wonder drugs do not exist for all conditions, especially some of our modern chronic ailments. Modern biology has transformed drug discovery into a rational design process when it works. Some great successes have occurred and are possible through this rational design paradigm, but this process may have run out of steam, at least relative to our hopes and expectations. The current rational drug discovery and development process is lengthy, expensive, and risky. Finally, the new integrative paradigm combines systems biology and data science. And this is, in some ways, why this course exists, because as data scientists, we can bring value to drug discovery and other areas of health and medicine, and we can assist in this integration of data and knowledge to produce new discoveries. So that is pretty cool. Until next time.